fly, anytime, anywhere, before anyone had even heard of the Wright Brothers. In balloons, dirigibles, and finally, an airplane.
He was the most famous person in his time. I mean, the English papers said that when people looked back at the turn of the century, years from then, they would remember only one name, Alberto Santos Dumont.
In many quarters, he was seen as far superior to the Wrights, indeed as the inventor of flight.
He was that legendary figure, 5'4", something like that, but larger than life at the same time, who just reached out and grabbed the public imagination by the lapels.
For Santos, flight wasn't just about lift, airflow, and engines. Flying was his theology, based on a belief that flight would unite the world, helping to end war and discord.
Contraption was flown across the English Channel by Louis Blériot. What this little plane could do impressed a young American who began to wonder even then about the military effects of not one, but many flying machines in the air at the same time. That young lieutenant was Henry HAP Arnold. He was to become the commanding general of the greatest Air Force in history. 2.5 million men and 70,000 aircraft.
The birth and growth of our Air Force into the powerful fighting unit it is today began within the United States Army. During this period, for almost his entire 46 years of service, General HAP Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, completely dedicated himself to building America's strength in the skies. We owe much to him for this development and for our air supremacy and victory in World War II. Here today is his story.
In 1911, when getting a heavier-than-air machine aloft was still something of a miracle, Second Lieutenant HAP Arnold was engaged in a project having nothing at all to do with flight, and everything to do with launching his military career. He was trying very hard to become a first lieutenant. Meanwhile, the discovery of the Wright brothers was becoming increasingly interesting to the United States Army. The spirit of the Wright brothers, that a practical answer could be found to almost any problem, was to be an inspiration to HAP throughout his life. The Wrights made it seem that anything was possible, creating an enthusiasm among young aeronauts that was sometimes carried to extremes. When HAP volunteered to learn to fly, his CO said, "I know of no better way for a person to commit suicide." Skeptical as many were, the Signal Corps had made concrete plans to obtain the necessary planes for a course of instruction. In school at the Wright Brothers field at Dayton, HAP labeled all the parts. Long ago, before nomenclature became complicated, this was the way it was. From Dayton, Ohio, to the Chief Signal Officer. Sir, I have the honor to report the following progress made by me in learning to operate a Wright airplane. During the week, I've made 12 flights with an instructor and 1 flight by myself. My instruction, under the personal supervision of the instructor in the machine, is finished. And from now on, all my flights will be made alone for experience. Very respectfully, Henry H. Arnold, 2nd Lieutenant, 24th Infantry. HAP was one of the first qualified pilots in the United States Army. In later years, he never lost the glow of pride and the respect for this symbol of achievement. HAP was the first to win the Mackay Trophy for air reconnaissance, and in 1912 he set a high-altitude record of 6,450 feet. In the earliest days of airmail service, he was one of our first couriers. All this experience in the embryo aviation division of the Signal Corps helped him to train others to fly and put him in the front line of those gaining important knowledge about military aviation. Not only better planes and more thorough pilot training, but more men for servicing planes. These were problems which HAP seemed to grasp with a quick understanding. When World War I came, the nation was still only barely aware of aviation's military potentialities. Suddenly, we were in desperate need of trained flyers. From the ranks of the infantry and from all services, men were carefully selected for the aviation section of the Signal Corps. Even more important was our need for aircraft. Administrative problems, including aircraft production, became HAP's responsibility. On the home front, HAP began to learn some lessons that were to have great meaning when he was in command of the Air Force many years later. To produce aircraft for war, one must plan and build long before. Many were the planes and engines finished too late for combat. HAP firmly resolved that America would not be caught short again. With the war over, the nation relaxed, but for HAP and other American airmen, this was the beginning of a battle to convince Americans of the importance of air power. Using some old German battleships as targets, Billy Mitchell showed what precision bombing could do. In the post-war years, HAP was in the forefront of those trying to keep the spark of interest in aviation alive. Stunt flying seemed one of the ways. To average Americans, this was worth watching. Meanwhile, there were real steps ahead important to aviation's future. Safer parachutes, for example. Observation from the air became a means of keeping forest fires under control. In the winter of 1932, under HAP's command, there were airdrops of food to the snowbound Indians of the Southwest. This, one of the earliest airlifts, was a prelude to that in Berlin 16 years later. There were also experiments in the field of photo reconnaissance. There was help in the development of new bombers. In these years, HAP was carrying forth the program of building the Air Corps. He was deeply convinced of its military importance. On his return, HAP was honored with the Mackay Trophy a second time. 1938, on the day before Hitler won a victory at Munich, Major General HAP Arnold was appointed Chief of the U.S. Army Air Corps.
Requires our nation to arm for air defense immediately. A strong Air Force is absolutely essential to keep war out of America.
From the beginning, the Commander-in-Chief found in HAP someone he could rely on. He respected HAP's judgment. Together, they saw that time to build and expand had now become precious.